Whether we like it or not, and a lot of people don't like it or don't think it works very well, American politics is based on the idea of having a two-party political system. This means that our elections are winner-take-all. One party wins, the other loses. We have, throughout our entire history, at almost every instance, had two major political parties that fought and competed for power, and some minor parties that sometimes had some success. But usually those minor parties either got taken over by a major party, or, in some cases, became a major party and one of the other major parties disappeared. So, when we talk about a two-party system, let's start with where it began. It started really in the debate over the Constitution and ratification of the Constitution. You had the Federalists and Anti-Federalists. The Federalists wrote the Federalist Papers calling for a strong central government, explaining the need to ratify the Constitution. And the Anti-Federalists felt that the Constitution didn't do enough to protect individual liberties. They feared too much power was being given to the national government. Well, these turned into the first two political parties. Alexander Hamilton and George Washington and James Madison were key Federalists. And on the Democratic Republican side, you had people like Patrick Henry and Thomas Jefferson. So Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson both served in George Washington's first cabinet. They worked for President Washington, and they believed totally different things about the role of the government in the economy. Alexander Hamilton thought that the government needed to play a very strong role in governing and setting up the way that the economy would work. Hamilton believed we needed a national bank that would regulate currency, set exchange rates, and do all sorts of things like that. The Federalists wanted a major role for the federal government, broad federal powers, whereas Jefferson and the Democratic Republicans feared that if we gave that much power, it would undermine the private sector, and the private sector wouldn't do as good a job as it otherwise would. Jefferson said, let's leave it just up to the people. The people have made this work so far. We fought a war for freedom, and we need to just protect individual liberty and individual freedom. So you have the Democratic Republicans fighting with the Federalists for power. After George Washington leaves office, you have a rift. John Adams runs for president as a Federalist, and Thomas Jefferson runs and loses as a Democratic Republican. In the next election, Jefferson came back and ran again, and he won and became the third president. So you have this battle back and forth. Meanwhile, George Washington, in his farewell address, warns against the divisiveness of political factions. Washington basically says that we need to stop fighting over power, because if we're too worried about power, then we're not going to actually get anything meaningful done. Washington feared that if you had factions or political parties, then being in charge would become more important to the parties than actually governing. And many would argue that that's what's exactly what has happened today, and that's the underlying basis of the partisanship and the fights between Democrats and Republicans now. You can see the seeds and the basis for the Democratic Party of today and the Republican Party of today in the split between Federalists and Democratic Republicans. If you were to extend their logic, their ideologies, the Federalists are much more similar to the Democrats. The Democrats support higher taxes, more government involvement in the economy to pay for things like environmental protection, which limits the freedoms of companies and private businesses, to pay for health care, to pay for food stamps and public schools. And many of these things are somewhat supported by Republicans, but Republicans, just like the Democratic Republicans, tend to be less willing to allow government to get involved in these things. So the Republican Party prefers lower taxes and prefers smaller government. That's the main idea. If you had to sum it up in one thing, the main difference between Democrats and Republicans today is that Republicans prefer a much more limited government, like the Democratic Republicans did, whereas Democrats are willing to have a larger government that's more involved in the economy to help protect people, to help protect workers, to help protect the environment, and help the poor who in a free market might not actually do very well at all. So I'll stop there. The Republicans tend to prefer as much freedom as possible. The Democratic Party of today tends to be more willing to limit economic freedom, the freedom to do whatever you want with your money, if it's going to lead to a greater sense of economic opportunity and equality for everyone.